Welcome back, and we might say westward ho now on America's Forum. I'm J.D. Hayward.
That's right, J.D. We're keeping a laser focus on that story in Nevada, the situation with the standoff between the federal authorities and the Bundy ranchers out there. A Nevada cattle rancher has locked horns with the feds over grazing rights, and now there are new reports that Senator Harry Reid's son may somehow be tied to the standoff. Those reports say a Chinese solar company with ties to Reid's son want land for a solar energy farm. The rancher says he has the right to graze his cattle on this land. It's where his family settled, and they've been using it for over 100 years. The government says that he owns millions of dollars in unpaid grazing fees, that being the rancher Bundy. Well, that hasn't changed. The Federal Bureau of Land Management has stepped down from this fight after 7 days.
I believe a press release has already been put forth that the BLM is going to cease this operation.
And there you hear the crowds from all the dozens and perhaps hundreds of supporters that came out there to support the Bundy family. Federal land managers say escalating tensions caused them to release all 400 cattle rounded up on this public land. The rancher says it is the citizens of America who brought the standoff to an end, not just him.
And so you have this situation, social media, what was called 2 decades ago the Sagebrush Rebellion, in the wake of federal activism against family ranchers and family farmers in the West, reigniting. And that is why we wanted to welcome in via telephone Chris Udall, the executive director of the Agri-Business Council of Arizona, and for purposes of full disclosure, former staffer to a U.S. Congressman by the name of J.D. Hayward. Chris, it's good to see you've made a success of yourself despite that time on a certain congressman's staff. We thank you for joining us today from Mesa. And let's begin with what Newsmax.com and other media outlets are reporting. The notion that Rory Reid, the son of Harry Reid, may be involved in this, a Chinese energy company looking for acreage for some sort of solar farm. And of course, as you and I both know, so much federal land in the West, there's always an angle on some sort of land swap or some sort of land deal. You've been through a lot of this. Give us your take on that Reid factor, if you would, please, sir.
Okay, well, thanks. First off, thanks, JD. I've always been told that leaders open up doors for people, and I consider you a true leader and have opened up doors for me in my future.
Well, thank you.
I wanted to, well, let's talk about land exchanges. The ones that I was involved in over the years, it seemed that there was so much bureaucratic inertia, you couldn't, by the time you got everything approved for a land exchange and had to go through the congressional process, the appraised values were changed and you had to start all over again. Just a real nightmare. But in this particular instance, it appears to me that maybe a particular senator and his son have some explaining to do.
To say the least, yeah, because when suddenly you get this going on and you get momentum behind something, but apparently that momentum stopped when the light of day came to this issue. And it's something that really gets to this common theme of what the public in general calls public lands, but what we've come to call government-controlled lands. Chris, you've spent a lot of time as a congressional staffer. You spent a lot of time in the saddle. Can you explain to people why grazing leases are so important to cattle ranchers in the West?
Sure, I'll do my best, and you can certainly chime in with your experience on the Hill. But from my experiences with many hours in the saddle, Western states, I think on a condition of statehood, are now just experiencing, I don't know what the percentage is, but most land out west is government controlled, as you mentioned. And that's not by taxpayers, that's by bureaucrats hired by taxpayers to control the land. And to me, it's just a rancher can't survive ranching out west without federal lands, be it BLM, Forest Service. Those leases and permits are required. I think you wouldn't find a single rancher out west that they'd probably love to have a ranch that's entirely private property, but that just isn't the case.
And because there's so
they're
little
relying
land
on
out
that
there, and you grew up in the Round Valley of Arizona, kind of checkerboarded land, some private, some government controlled, the only alternative for cattle ranchers in the West is to apply for those leases. Which leads to my next question, Chris, and it's part in your personal experience and those of your neighbors. Whole lot of families have left ranching. Has it been because of bureaucratic overreach and red tape and just some bad relationships with bureaucrats? In fact, is that probably what we're seeing in Nevada right now?
I would say yes, and all the above, plus additional reasons. I can give you a few examples of northeastern Arizona, and probably the reason why my dad sold our forest permit about 6 years ago. We've been ranching for a long time, since the late 1800s, not on the same piece of ground, but you know, it really does come down, and I witnessed this as a congressional aide as well as being in the saddle. You had employees hired by, in our case, the Forest Service, who had personal agendas or vendettas. They didn't like certain multiple uses on federal land. They sought predetermined outcomes, bureaucratic red tape. One of the big problems was herd reductions due to endangered species. I know a couple of ranchers that pulled out because of the introduction of the Mexican wolf in eastern Arizona and western New Mexico.
And you mentioned something here, Chris, that needs amplification. Let's not forget, it was former Arizona Governor Bruce Babbitt, during his days as Secretary of the Interior, introduced that wolf back onto land. And guess what happened? As Chris was pointing out right there, you had a situation where the wolves are predators. They were attacking the cattle that had the right to graze on the land. So you had that at loggerheads. Chris Udall, Executive Director of the Arizona Agri-Business Council, we thank you for your insights. And one other note here, because of the grazing rights, because so much of this land is locked up, you have a further paradox where these western counties have to actually apply to Washington for something called PILT, payment in lieu of taxes. So the bottom line is the land is tied up, and really no one is prospering from this, but you've got not environmentalists, but new prohibitionists trying to shut down legitimate multi-use of the land.
You mentioned this affects such a small percentage of the population, but as we saw, there was a real outpouring of support there. Maybe that will give some political will to change things, because change clearly is needed. We almost came to an armed standoff on this. More to come here on America's Forum. We'll get to your comments right after the break here. You still have time to reach us. We'll be back with more right after this commercial break.